Question one, how do I maintain boundaries when I'm tired and I don't have the energy to push back? This one comes up a lot, right? I think most people can relate to it. So, what's going on is if you think about the nervous system, I talk a lot about the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses, but there's actually a fifth called a flop response. And this is essentially where your body thinks that the only way to survive is to play dead, right? If you think about animals that have a dangerous predator and they just totally freeze, right? They might be a freeze response, but they might play dead until the threat has passed. And this is kind of what's going on in your brain. You're so overwhelmed. You've been so overwhelmed. You're so exhausted that your brain's just like, nah, like, we're done. And so it's a way of dealing with trauma. And we talk about the flop response a lot in like big T trauma discussions, but even like a little T trauma type of discussion of, I just don't have anything more to give anyone today. This is why I can't maintain my boundaries. But your body thinks there's just no chance of winning or escaping. So it's just like, forget it. And because your body or your brain thinks there's no chance of winning, that's why we don't think there's any point in speaking up and maintaining the boundary, because it just feels like it's going to take energy that I don't have, and it's not going to change anything anyway. Because if we just said, used words and said, hey, but you should take the garbage out, right? That would be very different. But sometimes we're just like, I don't want the whole discussion that follows that. I don't want to have that same argument again over it. And so there's another little piece of psychology that I think is really relevant here. It's a concept called ego depletion. And that says that this idea that our self-control and willpower, you hear this come up a lot with the idea of, like, I don't want to get into diet talk, but it will come up a lot in that idea, right? Like where our willpower and our ability to have any amount of self-control draws upon a limited pool of mental resources, and when they're exhausted, then we don't have the ability to have self-control or make decisions. Literally, our decision-making ability is diminished because if you think about the nervous system, it floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol. It sends blood flow to your limbs so that you can run when you're being chased by a lion, except that our threats are predominantly in the modern era of psychological threats, but your body's doing the same thing. And so, of course, you have less blood in your brain to make some clear decisions, to really think about it. So that's kind of what's going on, like physiologically. What's going on socialization wise is we've basically people pleased our way into the flop response. We feel so responsible for other people's comfort. We get so much validation when we are selfless and giving. We get so much positive feedback and so much appreciation that we don't get if we put ourselves first. And then, of course, we don't ever want to be seen as selfish. So we end up giving and giving until we have nothing left to give ourselves, including the thing that we would give ourselves in this moment is to maintain the boundary and hold other people accountable. But it makes sense, of course, that we would do that. If our validation only comes from other people, we don't get like a you go girl when we sat around and watched Netflix all day. Although, I mean, I tell myself that obviously I needed to rest, but we don't get that validation. We're not getting, there's no movies made about the heroic woman who watched like the whole season 3 of Bridgerton or whatever. Yeah, Asha says, such a people pleaser over here. And it's so not a reliable way of finding worth. No, it's not, because then you're totally, if you're not learning to look inward for the answer of, am I worthy? Am I valuable? Then of course it's going to be a thing where we're like, well, the only way that I get my cookies, my validation cookies, is if I go do the things for the other people and then they tell me I'm good and then I get to believe them and I get to feel good. And if we don't do that, or if you're socialized the way that most women are in a patriarchal society to put other people's needs above your own, or you're selfish, right? Like, of course, all of this is going to happen. Yeah. So the thought that often comes up that we talk about a lot in some of the other masterclasses and stuff that I do is I should say no, but it's easier to just do it myself, right? You're just like, the path of least resistance is just for me to do one more thing today, even though so-and-so should be doing it. So the feelings that can come up in this, particularly in the kind of when we're taking it to the extreme and calling it a flop response, is that you feel hopeless that there's any support, Your optimism is completely diminished. You don't think that there's any way that anyone's going to help you with this. You're angry at the person that is pushing or ignoring your boundaries. And sometimes we're not even expressing those, right? We kind of turn it inward and we beat ourselves up thinking, well, if I would have just said something, and somehow we take the blame for them not respecting boundaries or doing, whatever they've agreed to do. And then on top of all of that, on top of the hopelessness and the anger and the frustration, it's compounded by blame and shame because we start thinking we're the problem. Oh, I must be the problem because I didn't tell them that the boundary existed, or I didn't remind them that whatever. So, on top of everything else, we're blaming and shaming ourselves. So, it's this really, really, and that, of course, is going to make you more tired. Bless you, Rebecca. That's going to make you even more tired, right? It's going to put even more like a cycle into it, right? Because the blame and shame is going to wear you down too. So, yeah, Tracy said resistance is sometimes futile. Yeah, I mean, it really can feel that way. And sometimes, this isn't a thing that we want to solve when we're tired. This isn't a thing that we want to try to deal with when we're exhausted, right? This is a thing that we want to make a plan for it first thing in the morning, right? Of like, how am I going to do this thing so that I don't get depleted, so that I'm not, how do I remind people about my boundaries, or what am I going to do in the situation where like it's Thursday and the garbage cans aren't being taken to the curb again, right? Like whatever the situation is, just you want to do that when you're feeling refreshed and stronger. Okay, here's the kind of the behaviors that result from this. Of course, we worry about being selfish and we prioritize everyone's needs above our own, and we give until there's nothing left. We have nothing left to enforce our boundaries. Of course, we do that. Of course, by the time we reach the end of the day, we have nothing left in the tank because we don't get validated and praised for taking care of ourselves. Of course, we shame ourselves as if it's our fault that other people don't respect our boundaries or acknowledge our needs because we didn't do it right. This is a very common, it must be my fault always, right? And so, in some ways I can see that as like a coping mechanism. Like I used to do that because it felt like, then it made me feel like I was in control. Like, oh, if it's my fault, then I can fix it, right? And you kind of have to find the balance in there of, wait, but I'm taking responsibility for things that are absolutely not my issue. All right. So the outcomes, the kind of what these behaviors that are resulting from these feelings that are resulting from this belief system that we've been handed is we say yes when we mean no because we don't want to be seen as selfish or unlikable. We let folks violate our boundaries and don't hold them accountable because we're too exhausted to speak up. And then when we don't speak up and it goes and it goes and it goes, and we lash out or we shut down. And then what comes back in? The blame and shame for like letting it all come back to it. Ashley just, you guys can't see it, but she just mouthed shame. Like, yes, absolutely. And so we end up in this cycle of ego depletion and flop, and it's hard to recover from that and create no outcomes. So I have a few thoughts that you can kind of, I just said, get me off this vicious hamster wheel. Yes, yes, it's brutal. But the thing is like, that's the whole reason I love doing these talks, because I want to break it down so you can see here's where it starts. And there's all these places where it can keep all these ways that we can interrupt it, right? Like we can plan for it. We can be like, oh, this is me people pleasing because that's a survival technique because I was told this, but I don't believe that anymore. And you can start rewinding your brain. Or when you start feeling obligated, you can stop and be like, now, why do I feel obligated about this? Or when you find yourself doing the thing for the 50th time, I wonder why I'm doing this, right? Like there's so many opportunities when you understand where it starts and all the steps. There's so many ways where we can interrupt it without blame and shame, without any sort of, oh, there I am doing it again, right? Like we don't, it's just like, oh, there it is. Okay, well, I found it. And you'll find it earlier and earlier. And then you'll find yourself, it's much easier to stop doing those things. And when you stop doing some of them, you get to take that energy and go for the next round of things that are more difficult to deal with. Okay, so these are my tips. There's that one. I deserve care too. And I'm actually going to talk about that is like one of my thoughts that I worked on for a really long time. Okay, so talking about the people pleasing that I was doing, I started off with an idea of like, I wanted to get to I always prioritize my needs. But I really had to start with something like humans deserve care. I'm human. I deserve care too. And then I deserve care, right? And then I am learning how to prioritize my needs. And then I moved to I prioritize my needs, and then I always prioritize my needs. And so this was over probably 6 months. I would work on this thought for a while. I have them on sticky notes around my house in places where I'll notice them. So I'm thinking them on a, like there's always the one in the bathroom, and that's just one. And that's always my big thought that I'm working on. Right. And then once I realized that, like, I don't feel anything when I think that thought anymore. There's nothing in me that disagrees with it. I realize, like, oh, now I believe this and I can move on to the next thing. But part of this was also like this idea of I put all my lists of like stuff I need to do, things that I don't really enjoy doing. But I was like, if I enjoy doing things for other people and I like having things done for me, then if I do things for me, then I get to feel good. Like it just like my head exploded. I think I sent it to Amy and Amy was like, what? And her head exploded too. I'm just like, what just happened? But it was this idea. And then I renamed my task list of the things I didn't want to do. You deserve care. And then every time I had to do it, I thought, oh, I'm taking care of myself. Right. And so I was able to put into action also what I was working on with thoughts. But I love to give those little tidbits of something that I worked really, really, really hard on. But being able to set and maintain boundaries with my family came from this, because I was always like dropping everything and taking off, or like bending over backwards, moving heaven and earth for like something that actually wasn't that important to them, and then resenting them because it's like, I'm the best sister and the best daughter and the best auntie in the world. Why does no one appreciate like what, and it's like, nobody asked you to do that. And so it just became, of course I want to do all those things, but not to the detriment of my own needs. So that's kind of the journey, the behind the scenes of that one.